All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for folks that are a little bit farther west. My name is Jacob Bardeen. I'm a member of the CSA-DC Chapter Events Committee, and I'm also the Mid-Atlantic rep for AppOmni, the sponsor of today's webinar. As such, I'm doubly pleased to be introducing today's speaker, TimBach, who will be speaking about SaaS Security Management. Tim, who is the AppOmni VP of Engineering, will be discussing the current state of SaaS security, why it's important to build a full-fledged SaaS security program, and what components should be included in a SaaS security program. After Tim's presentation, if you'd like to learn a little more about AppOmni, please reach out to me, Jacob, J-A-C-O-B, at appomni.com. The AppOmni solution provides the foundation for building a SaaS security program by offering visibility into how your SaaS data access is configured, visibility into the security configuration of your SaaS application, and SaaS log normalization. With these components, AppOmni can help you rapidly implement a robust SaaS security program and get off the ground rapidly. Today's speaker is Tim Bach. Tim is the Vice President of Engineering at AppOmni, where he leads the security engineering for AppOmni's industry-leading SaaS security management platform. His career has focused on security engineering initiatives that make best-in-class security accessible and usable to teams of all sizes and industries. Before joining AppOmni, Tim was a senior security engineer at Apple, focused on security engineering and automation for cloud products. Prior to that, Tim managed part of the Salesforce product security team, leading security automation for cloud software and Salesforce App Exchange partners. So with that, I will turn it over to Tim.
Thanks, Jacob, and good afternoon, everyone. Looking forward to speaking with you today. As Jacob mentioned, we're going to be talking about SaaS security management. I'm going to be speaking primarily about what I've seen in the industry over the last several years, through speaking to a bunch of security leaders, also my own experiences, and trying to share whatever insights I can about how to build SaaS security programs. It's an area I think that, as I'll talk about today, it's an area I think that we have a little bit of work to do. This is not the first time as a security industry that we've come into new technologies or technologies that have become newly prominent and had a little bit of work to do to put the right security programs in place. So I'm very excited to talk to you about that today. Just a real quick reminder, Jacob and Alyssa asked me to remind you that you can put questions in the Q&A functionality on Zoom. We will see those, and as we reach the end of the presentation, I'm hoping to have 10 or 15 minutes to answer some questions and have an open discussion. So if you do put those questions in there, we'll be able to get them brought up and discussed. So just quickly, Jacob, I appreciate the introduction. I just want to say a little bit about my background, specifically on how it influences our thinking at AppOmni about what we're building. And this will probably be the most I talk about AppOmni specifically throughout the presentation. The rest of this is going to be about general programs. And I hope you'll see how my experience and the experience of the team leads those two to be the same thing. So this is actually my first foray the last couple of years into the world of being a security vendor. This is my first time on the side of the table that's selling solutions. I have previously always been on the side of the table trying to buy the right solutions and implement the right solutions. This, I think, more than anything, influences how I think about our engineering function at AppOmni and what we're building, because I have been, while I have used a lot of great security technology, I've also been the unfortunate victim of sales processes and sales discussions that are totally divergent from the product or the technology that ends up being delivered once the PO is signed. I think that as an industry, security has a lot of amazing technology that's being built. I also think we unfortunately have a sizable minority of solutions that have a little bit of snake oil in them. So one of my kind of golden rules at AppOmni for our engineering organization is that we build a product that solves real challenges and we sell what we've built. So we're very intentional about not over-promising and also not under-delivering. The entire founding team at AppOmni, as well as the entire engineering management team, all comes from backgrounds where they've experienced a lot of these challenges themselves. and they all come from backgrounds where they are used to building technology to fix those challenges. And so I really view what we do as a security engineering team that's going to be amortized through a product to solve the same challenges we would be solving at large companies if we were on those security teams, but doing it in the form of a product. So that's where I come from. As Jacob mentioned, I spent a long time on the Salesforce security team. I built out the security engineering function there. And since I just said that we build security engineering products, the way that we define security engineering at Salesforce and the way that it persists through in my kind of mentality to AppOmni is security force multipliers. So we build technology that allows security decision makers and security engineers to have the data they need, to have the capabilities they need to make good decisions. If a computer can do a rote task in the world of security, let's have it do it so that the security engineers can focus on the hard problems and focus on making the right decisions. So with that, I know I just told you and Jacob just told you we're here to talk about SaaS security. But before we do that, I want to just do some quick level setting. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I do think it'll be pretty much agreed upon kind of day-to-day basic stuff for a lot of the people on the call here. But I want to first talk and think a little bit about the job of security leaders and organizations as we do them today. Speaking for the common case, but when I think about a security program, when I think about the things that are going to keep CISOs up at night or that I'm used to worrying about as a security practitioner, I'm thinking about the most critical areas of the business that I need to invest my time and my resources, whether that's human resources or whether that's monetary resources or technology resources, but where I need to invest the resources of my security program at protecting pieces of the business. Now, this is obviously not an exhaustive list because there are only 3 icons on the screen, but where I think about kind of the 3 big areas of sensitivity of effort for a security organization. First, I think about servers. So I think about on-prem, whether colo or infrastructure as a service, but some sort of server infrastructure that's going to be serving either a product or an internal application, internal services, doing data workloads, data metrics, stuff like that. Almost all of us as security organizations, we have some sort of server infrastructure to manage, and we have the automation and the technology that goes with that. Then we have networks, internal networks, VPNs, et cetera. These are things that are mostly used by internal users. It's kind of the backbone of the company. And they're probably under an interesting amount of strain or kind of an interesting evolution after the last 12 to 14 months. I think everyone's world, it looks a little bit different after March of 2020 to today. What loads are on the VPN and what's being connected to it to internal networks has certainly changed a little bit. And the last big area I think that we spend a lot of time on these days, endpoints. So corporate or bring your own assets like laptops and cell phones, depending on the organization, there's going to be more or less sensitive data on these. They may just be thin clients, in which case your security posture is kind of going one way. But in the case of engineers, you may have a MacBook with an SSD full of the entire company's source code. That's the keys to the kingdom. And so obviously the security posture for an endpoint like that is going to be markedly different than a thin client. But at the end of the day, when we think about areas like this, critical areas, we're thinking about a security program with some common elements. And we're going to talk about some of those common elements and how they apply or should apply to SaaS security as we go through a little bit. And I'm really going to try and talk about why, in my view, over the last several years, I've come to think of SaaS as kind of the 4th icon that I would put up on a screen like this to be treated in the same way as these 3 areas are with regards to the security programs that we put around them. So thinking at a little bit of a macro level, of those three areas, and there, like I said, there's certainly more than just those 3 in most organizations, but organizations that, or parts of the organization that we consider critical from the point of view of what we're going to invest resources in as a security team. What makes them critical? How do we come to that decision? If I'm looking at a net new piece of technology or a new piece of the organization, a new business unit, I have to decide at some point, how much energy do I put into this as a security leader? How much effort do I have to put into securing it? In some ways, this is like an exercise you might go through if you've ever had the joy of being on a team responsible for integrating a new acquisition into your security program. You have to get an overview and understand, where am I going to put my energy? So looking through this, I mean, obviously we have kind of a 3-axis based system, like confidentiality, integrity, availability. That's one way to start judging things. Some more subjective questions I might ask, how is it used in the context of the business? What data is stored on it? What data is it used to process? Does it give me access to pivot to anything else? If I have access to a given system, if I breach it, do I get stuck there? Can I get into something a little bit more complex? Is this like the weak link in my security of a major piece of infrastructure? And then how does it impact the business if it's compromised? I think maybe this is the question that is asking kind of what's the final score to make my decision. But at the end of the day, that's what we're looking to protect, right? So if I have to decide how much energy to put into securing something, one of the questions I'm definitely going to ask is, what's the worst case if I fail? And I think this is where sometimes, especially in SaaS, we get hung up and we might inadvertently, as a security team, give the wrong answer to this question. One of the examples I used for this, I think it was in 2015 or so. Some of you might remember the HipChat breach. And I remember talking to some colleagues that kind of, dismissed it a little bit. It's like, oh, the chat system, it's a chat system. So they have access to GIFs or to memes. What we ended up realizing, I think, as a security community is that, yes, it was a chat system, but it was a chat system used by developers. And so those chat logs, in addition to all the GIFs and the memes, had a lot of CI keys or server keys or various pieces of the keys to the kingdom when it came to deploying a code. Or, what do developers talk about all day? They talk about bugs. So if I find a channel discussing bugs in the auth layer that maybe haven't been patched yet, I don't actually have a supply chain breach, right? Because I can't commit code to prod, but I know exactly what I'm going to look for in terms of a weak point in a system. And so that's kind of an example, or at least one that comes to my mind, of holistically evaluating something for, especially in the SaaS world, for what does it mean if there's a breach. Okay, so we've talked about, kind of key examples of critical technology. We've talked about how do we decide something is critical from a security point of view. So we've decided it's critical. What are we going to do about it? And these are the 6 very, very high level common things I think about for a mature security program. This is going to be kind of the last overview of a traditional security program. And then I want to talk about why I think these should be applied to SaaS and how I don't think we're doing a great job as an industry doing that today. So at a high level, as a security organization, I'm thinking about, what am I protecting? What does good look like? How am I going to monitor that what I'm protecting meets that good state? And I'm going to be maintaining relationships and shared process with the peer teams that are going to fix it. So most of the time, a security organization is not actually the ones fixing a security problem. It's not, sometimes we are, but you have to think about it, most of the time, we are responsible for understanding when something is a problem and helping drive remediation. So we're going to work with an IT department, or we're going to work with a corporate security department. We're going to work with the engineering department to actually get those security issues fixed and drive that remediation and also drive that accountability. It's our job to surface to the business and the leadership team where are the risks and what needs to be done to fix them. And then, of course, advocate for getting them fixed in a reasonable timeline, lay out the clear issues if there's going to be a risk acceptance process, and be trusted advisors to our peer organizations. But we're going to maintain those relationships and help drive remediation as opposed to fixing it ourselves most of the time. Obviously, of these 6 bullet points, the implementation details of each one is really where we as security teams earn our paycheck, right? If it was as simple as just laying out this process, being CISO might be a slightly less stressful job. But at a high level, this is kind of the key pillars of a mature security program, especially as we think about it with regards to endpoints or infrastructure or kind of more traditional areas of security focus today. So now we can get back to what I promised we were talking about today, which is SaaS and SaaS security. This slide probably doesn't come as a shock to anyone. This is a prototypical slide that I'm sure you've seen before of the adoption of cloud, right? So cloud's continuing its upward trend. I think this data was actually surveyed before COVID or early in COVID. So there might actually be more of a spike in 2020, 2021. But the end result, the takeaway here is, again, not as a surprise to anyone, cloud is going to continue to become and continue to grow as the dominant form of where we're putting workloads, where we're putting infrastructure, where we're putting business processes. I actually, I'm not positive I agree that by 2032, we're going to be at, let's probably say 98, 99% cloud. I think there will always be use cases that go on-prem or use cases that are non-cloud, but certainly we're going to get up towards that 90% mark. Let's dive a little bit deeper into that thought, right? Because just saying that everything's moving into the cloud, not really a valuable statement from a security point of view. First, like I said, it's not new to anyone. And second, the cloud, as a term, has pretty much lost all meaning. It's very vague and generic, and it's just kind of, oh, the cloud. It's in the cloud. What does that really mean, right? Infrastructure, IaaS, is the cloud. And we've generally, I think, as a security industry in the past decade, gone through kind of the cycle of understanding, the cycle of growth that IaaS brings with it, new or varied threat vectors compared to on-prem or co-located infrastructure. I would say, and from the security organizations I've talked to, I think I'm safe in saying this, that it's an uncontroversial opinion that IaaS needs to be monitored with CSPM type tools for configuration, fleet management, making sure you're following best practices, whatever those are, on AWS, GCP, Azure, et cetera. Choose your own flavor of IaaS. So hey, that's one part of the cloud down, more or less. But we did take some time to come to that conclusion, right? IaaS started really a huge growth curve in the last decade, mid 2000s, early 2010s. And it took us a little bit as an industry to catch up to the novel threat vectors. And I think there's always this temptation to say, oh, it's in the cloud, security is taken care of. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later around the shared responsibility model. But it certainly took some time as IaaS adoption took off before we started putting the automation and the security tooling in place to achieve our security program goals as security organizations with this new variant of infrastructure technology. So then we look at SaaS, and in regards to SaaS, a lot of the security leaders I've spoken with over the past couple of years end up relatively surprised by their exposure or potential exposure in SaaS, because I think even more than infrastructure, it's generally a blind spot for security programs. And we're going to dive into that a little bit deeper of why that blind spot exists and how SaaS differs from IaaS in a couple of slides. But generally speaking, let's first determine what's in an organization's SaaS deployments. Thinking back a couple of minutes ago, step one of crafting a security program, I want to understand what I'm protecting, because that's the first step in making that judgment of its criticality, which is going to influence what resources and what energies I bring to bear on securing this piece of the business. So according to Gartner research, large enterprises are deploying on average more than 50 SaaS applications across the enterprise. So that's in total across all business units, and it does not double count business units that don't talk to each other. So if marketing spins up a Slack instance and engineering spins up a separate Slack instance because they're not talking with each other, that's still just one SaaS application. I think obviously what you'll see when we talk about a number of 50 is kind of a long tail, right? So you're going to have a couple, and in my experience, it's going to be anywhere from 5 to 15 really large SaaS applications in a business, and you're going to have a long tail of the smaller ones. Whether those are kind of tertiary clouds that are connecting to the business via another SaaS cloud, or if it's just point-specific solutions. HubSpot comes to mind. I know a lot of organizations that use Salesforce as their primary sales tool, and HubSpot for very specific marketing purposes. So HubSpot is a small cloud relative to Salesforce being the big cloud. The graph I have up here, right, these are just the big ones. And so I'm talking here about this is 10 or 15 clouds listed out. I think it's 10 listed out with an et cetera, but I think this survey was about the top 5 plus the top next 10 after that. So these that 15 really big clouds. And when I say big, I'm talking about 7-figure spend a year for a large enterprise in seat and support costs alone, right? So you're paying 7 figures plus just in the licenses to use Salesforce or SAP. That's not counting the investment the business is making in internal heads or a center of excellence to manage the cloud, not taking into account GSIs implementing the cloud. So most major deployments are going to come with services from an Accenture, a PwC, a Deloitte, or maybe even a Microsoft of the world. And they're going to be doing the implementation of that cloud. So that just ramps up the cloud spend even more. And most notably, this graph is just about SaaS. So when you see Microsoft at the top there, we're not talking about Azure IaaS cloud. We're talking about Microsoft 365. So just looking at this, 2019, $100 billion spent on these 15 SaaS apps. We're starting to get an idea of what the biggest apps in an enterprise are going to be. And that means what the data that SaaS is containing for enterprise. So Microsoft, that's going to be collaboration and productivity data. It's going to be internal comms. So that's O365 and Teams. We're going to leave out email for the purposes of this discussion. Email straddles a couple of domains. I don't really consider it SaaS, even if you're talking about Exchange through 365. Securing email, securing Exchange, that's really its own domain of security expertise in my mind. So let's just leave that out of the SaaS discussion. You got Salesforce. Salesforce is going to be customer data. It's going to be sales data. It's going to be all the data that makes up your earnings forecast. So if you're a public company, we're talking about the things that are going to drive the CEO's announcement each quarter. So that data is all coming out of Salesforce. We got ServiceNow. ServiceNow has all your IT workloads, got your provisioning data. They've got a security product, so it might have all your security analytics data. We've got Workday. Workday is going to be HR data. That's going to be financial data, sensitive personal information. Also of note, Salesforce, ServiceNow, and Workday are all in the last year developing and pushing COVID-related offerings. So that's going to be employee health screening questionnaires and temperature checks at the door to allow you to reopen your office. Salesforce notably and Microsoft are also pushing out solutions to manage vaccination. So that's going to be vaccination records and integration with government health databases, and tying that into customers, whether they are state or federal, or then of course individual business customers when it comes to health screenings before employees come back to the office. So just some more private information that we're putting in these SaaS clouds. And of course, we're trying to deploy these COVID solutions in the span of 3 months, which is another challenge that is related to what we'll talk about in a little bit about how SaaS can become a blind spot. So the SaaS, the additional SaaS records here that we're seeing, what's interesting to me, SaaS apps are not just enabling the business today, they are actually being and becoming the business systems of record. So if your Salesforce goes down, your sales team's not calling anyone that day. You can just check Twitter for a couple of the major Salesforce outages to confirm that. Okta, Okta is your identity record. And unlike AD, you don't have Okta servers running in your colo or in your data center. It's managed through a web API and it's managed through REST APIs or through an IT admin logging in to admin.okta.com. And yes, I would say Okta is one of the few SaaS clouds that is known very, very well to IT and security teams because it falls, clearly in their domain when it comes to provisioning that SaaS application. But at the end of the day, we look at these kind of graphs, we look at the logos on the right side here. We are truly thinking about SaaS applications as the system of record or the primary business system for a lot of the day-to-day functions of the business. Communication, HR, identity, code, customers, sales, marketing, productivity, document collaboration. That's all going through SaaS clouds at a lot of modern enterprises, and especially, some of the industries that I would have said in 2019 were behind the curve on SaaS implementation, and so maybe not as relevant to this conversation, quickly adopted SaaS. I know from some individuals at Slack that there were major deals that they were forecasting 1, 2, 3 quarters out. March 2020 hits, and it was a next day deal. Turn SaaS on or turn Slack on across the fleet. Same with Microsoft 365. So we're definitely seeing increased adoption, right? Okay, we have all these logos. We know what the major SaaS clouds are. So let's go back. Let's make our inferences and answer the question: what is in enterprise SaaS clouds? Well, it's going to be customer data. It's going to be financial data. It's going to be employee PII, PHI, code and keys to the kingdom. You know, GitHub is maintaining code in a lot of cases. GitHub Actions are doing the deployments and building the final artifacts going out to customers. Sensitive internal discussions on Slack or Teams. And that harkens back to what we talked about with the HipChat breach. We've got corporate documents, you know, Google and Microsoft suites providing all of your document collaboration, including most likely legal documents, hiring documents. You know, I've talked to multiple security engineers who found folders on shared drives containing all of the offer letters for a given department on Google Docs before, right? So if the Google suite or the Microsoft 365 suite is where your document creation primarily resides, you again have SaaS sharing rules, potentially protecting a lot of that data. And then you see the same sort of concerns that you might see with an S3 bucket, right? And that to tie it back to infrastructure. And then IT processes, data, and workloads. So we have this list of in the general case, what we think is going to be residing on an enterprise's SaaS deployments across the board. Let's think about that in the same lens that we were talking about deciding on security program resources earlier. Is this critical data? You know, reputation, we have reputational liability if any of this leaks. And even if we're not super concerned about that, for those enterprises that are subject to compliance regulations like GDPR or CCPA, most of the data in these systems has a high probability of being in scope for those compliance frameworks, which means a misconfigured SaaS cloud that is overly permissive with that data is going to cause GDPR liability or CCPA liability. Certainly business process disruption. You know, if you were able to modify data in my Salesforce or modify data in my ServiceNow, you can greatly disrupt my IT operations, my sales operations, my day-to-day business operations, much less if you get into my Workday or my Microsoft or my Okta, you can really just kind of grind business to a halt. And then with Slack and GitHub, we're talking about source code or supply chain vulnerabilities. So I would argue, and so certainly a decision about criticality of data rests with an individual security organization. I cannot give you a prescriptive guide to whether or not your SaaS deployment holistically kind of meets your bar of criticality to invest a full-fledged security program in. I would argue that 100% of large businesses that I have talked to do need to be treating their SaaS deployments as a critical infrastructure stack, essentially. And none of them are to the same level that we would expect a security organization to focus security energies on for other types of critical stacks. So to me, you know, this is a security double standard. And I'm not saying that we as a security industry are intentionally making it a double standard. I think it's a blind spot for us in a lot of ways. So on the left side of this slide, I've kind of laid out the security program pieces at an implementation level for things like networks and endpoints, and then also for what we might do for code. If you are a business that delivers either a web application is what I put up here, or actual code, you're going to put various implementation pieces in place for your security program. You're going to be monitoring endpoints. For code, you're going to be doing code analysis, CAST and SCM, vulnerability scanning. You're investing probably a full team in partnering with engineering organizations and giving them best practices and guidance. SDLC is usually a whole team's job to implement and maintain and run. I certainly spent several years of my life thinking about bug SLAs and remediation timelines and risk acceptance and stuff like that. So we have these whole programs and whole organizations thinking about these standards for other critical areas of the business. With SaaS today, we are, as a security community, generally treating it like a vendor review. And this is how it becomes a blind spot to us. So individual lines of business are acquiring SaaS clouds. Sometimes they don't even go through procurement. Sometimes they do. But we're treating the acquisition of a Salesforce instance, or ServiceNow instance, a Slack enterprise grid instance. We're treating those as vendor reviews in which certain lines of business want to procure this software. And so if that goes through procurement, that's likely hitting a security team who's going to do the standard VSA. And they're going to say, does this vendor meet our security requirements? And that's great. That is a key piece of starting with this, right? But coming from Salesforce, I can tell you that we are never going to, as a cloud provider, fail a VSA. We have a very large security organization dedicated to making sure that we are a secure company. So I really do believe that when it comes to SaaS clouds, if you, as a user of a SaaS cloud, are breached, it will not be because Microsoft's infrastructure was breached. That is where a VSA ends, though. You're thinking about, does Microsoft or Salesforce or ServiceNow, do they do proper patching? Do they have firewalls in place? Do they have good SDLC processes in place? And I can assure you that they do. So it's really all about how we, as a security organization, are then monitoring the use of those systems. And I don't think most organizations are today. It's a point in time vendor review, and then marketing is approved to buy Salesforce, or whatever line of business wants Slack is approved to buy Slack. And that's where traditionally our involvement as security teams ends. So let's take that mindset as a parallel back to endpoints. If I do a vendor security review on Microsoft and then buy 1,000 Windows laptops for my organization and deploy them to 1,000 employees and look away, and I never look at them again, my organization is going to get breached, and it is not going to be Microsoft's fault. It will be my fault because as a security organization, I did not do my job with endpoint monitoring, with firewalls, with continuous scanning. If I treat endpoint security as point in time at the point of purchase, I will fail in my responsibilities as a security organization. And I think that's what we're seeing primarily with SaaS today. And that's how it becomes a blind spot. This is how companies are being attacked today. We looked at Salesforce, or we looked at ServiceNow, or we looked at Slack, or we looked at GitHub once when the PO was signed, and we never looked at it again, which means these living systems that are managed by the lines of business have more and more and more business critical data pumped into them, and very, very little security oversight. These are systems that with the click of a button, I can inadvertently expose every piece of data in them to the public internet. And we traditionally, as a security industry, do not have continuous monitoring pointed at those systems in order to prevent this from happening. I drew the comparison a little earlier today to an open S3 bucket with one of the examples I was talking about. And I think that is a very good analogy to at least understand the point. Open S3 buckets have been a common vulnerability for years now, many years. And now, as IaaS has taken off, we have the scanning in place to if you've deployed proper scanning, almost immediately know that you have an open S3 bucket and to remediate that. We can have the same level of damage inflicted with the same ease of making a mistake on SaaS. And most security organizations today are not putting the same technology in place to catch it. So we're seeing more and more news stories, month over month, of places where this happened. Accidentally exposing millions of records from a SaaS cloud to the public internet, or to guest users that are coming in through unauthenticated means to go to a support portal or a job application portal, and are able to use that unauthenticated entry point to query the API and to pull out data, or to have a malicious user create and connect an OAuth application to the SaaS cloud and pull out all that data. And we just do not, as an industry, have enough monitoring around this because it's a blind spot to us. So this is, again, going back to Gartner research. Most new software purchases will not come as a surprise in the enterprise are cloud-based. And Gartner believes, and I have to say I agree with them, kind of exactly what we were talking about earlier. The cloud systems are secure. You're not going to breach the infrastructure or create a tenancy bug in these major enterprise SaaS applications. That said, They have thousands and thousands of settings, and those settings today are being managed by lines of business without proper oversight or guidance from security organizations or compliance organizations. And so the vast, vast majority, Gartner's belief is 99% of breaches coming out of cloud systems will be the fault of the customer. And this is where I'm really trying to draw the line together to, we have to, as a security industry, recognize this common blind spot and put the same level of care around SaaS clouds as we do around the other key parts of our stack. So what does that mean? I think it's very similar in concept to what we did in IaaS, and the security program is very similar in concept to what we do anywhere else in the enterprise. So shared responsibility model, again, something that I don't think is going to be novel to anyone on this call, but I've laid this out here as kind of a quick visual reference to how does the shared responsibility model differ from different pieces of technology. So on-prem, obviously it is all our responsibility. Infrastructure as a service, we pushed a little bit onto the cloud provider, right? So they obviously do all the physical security, the data center security, and they contribute to network control and host infrastructure. Depending on the provider and the setup, they may also contribute to patches and upgrades on the server, but they may not. The rest, what's in white, is on us. And that's where we put in effort with infrastructure security monitoring, specifically for IaaS clouds. We've put in effort to build security programs around that and to solve that problem. And I think that as an industry, we've gotten pretty good about that. So we go all the way to the right here, and with SaaS, you're putting more on the provider. Like it's not nothing. The SaaS providers are doing work here, and there is some built-in security that's helpful to us. But what still remains on us, the customer, is going to be those three at the top. So compliance and data governance, identity and access management, and using the built-in application controls properly. So you'll recognize that kind of all three of those areas are things that have to do with the day-to-day operation of these SaaS clouds. So high-level recommendations, in each of those categories. Application controls, this is actually, I think, the trickiest one. You got to understand in each SaaS cloud what systems, roles, and user-level settings are security relevant. Depending on the SaaS cloud, this is going to be a large task or just an annoying task. GitHub, for instance, has on the order of 20 to 50 settings that are worth looking at, and each repo then has an access control list. So with hundreds of repos, certainly that's a challenging task, but it's not gargantuan. If I look at a Salesforce or a Workday or a ServiceNow, we're talking thousands of relevant settings. So you need to invest time, and this is, in my opinion, a great place for automation. But you can certainly do it by hiring several people and having them think about it and become experts in those systems. But we need to determine the correct values. So from a security program point of view, this is determining your known good state. So we need to determine the correct values, and then we need to ensure they remain properly configured at all times. And we need to monitor them as the systems upgrade. So not only is SaaS a living system from your side, right? You have your business making changes day to day. It's also a living system from the provider side. New features are coming out all the time. What a setting means can change. The default value can change. The recommended value can change. The implication of the setting being one value or another can change as you deploy new features or add new data. So these really are living systems, and understanding your good state is not a point in time process. The second piece of the shared responsibility model that falls on our side is identity and access. Now this isn't easy, but you can get a lot of the way there by making sure that you're only allowing access to your SaaS clouds via your IDP, whether that's AD or Okta or Google Identity, whatever IDP and SSO solution you use as a company, I'd highly, highly recommend that you only access SaaS clouds via that SSO solution. If possible, use SCIM or some other sort of automated provisioning to get even more of the work centralized to one point of effort. But however you do provisioning, make sure that you are properly enforcing least privilege in SaaS Cloud by using whatever RBAC control scheme the SaaS Cloud has. Salesforce, that's going to be profiles and permission sets. A lot of other SaaS clouds will use the terms roles and groups, or groups and teams, or roles and teams. The label of these entities varies from cloud to cloud, but they're all going to have some concept of a role-based access control system. And it's very, very important that, just like anywhere else in the business, the security team is pushing for least privilege, minimizing the blast radius if something goes wrong. SaaS, more than almost any other stack I've seen, is it has a tendency to violate least privilege. It can be very confusing to provision access to users sometimes, and the administrators of SaaS clouds are individuals in the line of business who need to get the business unblocked. So most frequently, you'll see new users cloned from existing users, causing access drift. I got cloned from my boss's user, then I needed more access, and so I was given more and more groups until I got what I needed, and then my new hire was cloned from me, so they start with more access than they need, and the process goes on and on. So SaaS clouds seem to be very vulnerable to access drift and violation of least privilege. So important to keep an eye on that. And again, this to me is an area where automation is brilliant. Automation can understand what access an individual should have access to, and do the hard work of parsing all of their entitlements together for you. And ideally also potentially give you insights into or suggest what can be removed. Something that automation is great for, and that is very time consuming for humans. And finally, with regards to compliance, I touched briefly on the idea earlier that a lot of data in SaaS clouds is relevant to GDPR or CCPA or other various compliance frameworks. At a high level, what your compliance team needs to be thinking about is the same thing they're thinking about for infrastructure and for business processes, HR processes, stuff like that. I've worked with several organizations undergoing, for instance, SOC 2 audits, and SaaS is frequently a blind spot in SOC 2 audits because we don't think about it traditionally. Again, going back to this is a blind spot. A lot of auditors are starting to think more about SaaS for SOC 2 compliance. And so one of the things that I highly recommend is getting ahead of that. So that if your auditor at your next SOC 2 Type 2 or something like that asks, what are you doing for SaaS, and how can you assure me that you have access attestations and proper access reviews for what's critical in your SaaS clouds, you have an answer for them. And once again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but this is an ideal place for automation, because this is where an automated system can understand what types of data and what SaaS clouds are relevant, to what classifications or what compliance categories of data, and then do that mapping just like it does for role-based access control to say, who has access to these types of data? Does this violate my compliance obligations? And help you fix it proactively. But also that automation is as a side effect, generating evidence for your audits. You have evidence of every time your automation has reviewed those systems, and you can provide that to auditors as needed. But SaaS does add some unique challenges, just like IaaS added unique challenges when we think about traditional infrastructure security. SaaS is going to make all of these concepts complicated in its own very special way. So I mentioned earlier, SaaS updates frequently. It varies. So there's not like one day a quarter that all SaaS clouds are going to update. Each provider is going to update on a different cadence. So that adds some challenge. And also there's going to be a new set of documentation to understand, right? So you need to have either automation in place or experts that are on your team that are reviewing these changes and being experts in those systems so they understand what those changes mean. These systems, they evolve rapidly on both sides. Again, they're administered by the line of business usually, which means you have individuals outside of the security organization that you're gonna have to build relationships with who are making these decisions, and their motivations or their business goals might not be aligned with security teams, because it might be an organization that security doesn't frequently partner with. And finally, there is a total lack of standards-based frameworks for this. Every SaaS cloud is different when it comes to their settings. Every SaaS cloud is different when it comes to their APIs. And every SaaS cloud is different when it comes to the audit events that you can pull out of them. The other unique challenge around audit events is that they're delivered after the fact. So traditional threat hunting techniques have very little effect in SaaS because you're not going to be able to evict someone from the estate before they can pull data out of it. For instance, if you assume that compromise and the threat you're hunting for is exfiltration of data, it's very likely that one of the first events you're going to get through an audit stream or an event log stream from a SaaS provider is a download record. As soon as I get the download event that 1,000 accounts have been downloaded or reports exported, that data is already gone. I can't threat hunt and evict that attacker because they've already achieved their goal. So all that event log does for me is let me notify legal that a breach occurred. And this is because, with SaaS, you don't have as much movement or thrashing around in a system to identify as a threat hunter, but also because the events are frequently delayed. You don't have an agent on the metal that's running the SaaS application. In some SaaS clouds, it can take just 10 minutes, and some SaaS clouds don't guarantee logs until 24 hours after the fact. So it's not as valuable to me to predicate my security program on threat hunting when I'm not getting those events quickly. I think the last piece I want to talk about, the key takeaway here, assuming that you all agree with me, or some of you agree with me, and you're thinking about a SaaS security program, how do you stand one up? And I think that the good news here is, from my point of view, it's just like standing up a security program for any other part of the business. Your implementation details, once again, are going to be a little bit different. But at the end of the day, you build an inventory. You have to know what you want to protect before you can protect it. This is where all good security programs start. A CISO that I worked for once, I think, put it in a simple way to me that has stuck with me for a long time. He said, most people think that what keeps me up at night is what pieces of the company are least secure, but that's actually the second problem. The thing that keeps me up at night is not knowing what I don't know about yet. To me, SaaS feels like kind of the epitome of that concern. It's right now, for a lot of security leaders, what's in their SaaS cloud is basically a dark room, right? And so the first thing we want to do is understand what SaaS clouds we have deployed and what data is in them. Once you know that, you can start to put together a plan. You can start to understand, what do I have to do next? What do I have to do next? I have to identify responsible individuals and teams. And so that's potentially building a RACI matrix to understand who's responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. I'm sure most of you have dealt with the joy of RACI matrices before. But in some way, shape, or form, you have to know that for each of these SaaS clouds that you identified in step one, who do I go to fix them if I find problems? And these are likely going to be new relationships for a security team to build or to expand upon, because they likely have not been built prior to this. Next, what does a known good state look like? This is, I think, where the challenge really begins, because like we were just talking about, the SaaS clouds are incredibly complex. They're varied, they're dynamic, and they're not at all standardized. We built AppOmni because of this problem. My strong belief is that just like some of the benefits you see in infrastructure as a service by amortizing security skills, this is where automation can come into play, and you can amortize the cost of understanding SaaS clouds by using a provider that spends all of their focus and all of their resources on being experts in these clouds. And so that's what I strive to do with our security engineering team every day, is let us be the experts in Workday and ServiceNow and Salesforce and Microsoft and G Suite and the whole long tail, and infuse that expertise into a product. That said, obviously I am a vendor in this space. So to be transparent, this is certainly something that you can build as an internal team. You just have to understand the cost, benefit, and ROI of that. It is going to require a whole new team of experienced security engineering talent spending their entire job as full-time employees understanding these clouds, monitoring these clouds, and remaining experts in these clouds. So it is not something that I'm coming here with fear, uncertainty, and doubt and saying you have to buy a SaaS security management platform or you will be vulnerable. You can definitely do this in-house. It will just be a lot of work. And I think that's one of the things to understand about SaaS. There are going to be 50 plus apps in your estate. They are going to be quite complex. They are going to be continuously living. So just understand the breadth of that challenge when you make that determination, whether you are going to build or buy. once you have that known good state, you just have to monitor it constantly. And this is the other piece that's going to be a change. SaaS today is a point-in-time analysis. And the problem with point-in-time analysis of living systems is it is out of date as soon as you finish. Just like a pen test. Pen tests are valuable pieces of a security program, but they're not continuous. So they get out of date very quickly. As you identify issues in the real world state that don't comply to your known good state, you've generated your backlog. Now it's just like any other security program. You are going to continuously monitor that state and work with responsible peer teams to drive remediation. So I'm going to the IT team, going to the marketing team, I'm going to the sales ops team, whoever is administering these systems. I have to get buy-in from them, and we have to have a collaborative process for security to identify issues and for those teams to remediate issues and security to validate that they're fixed and that they stay fixed. I would advise pushing this left as much as possible. SaaS deployments are in fact, in a lot of ways, especially the big ones, very similar to code deployments. They are going to have sandboxes and staging environments. Whatever automation you use, again, build versus buy, but whatever your automation is, point it at the dev and the sandbox instances and catch these new SaaS security issues before they go to production in the same way that you would with code, and monitor and judge success in the same way you would with code. And my last piece of advice, as you're ingesting SaaS event data, make sure it's normalized and make sure it goes to the same place that you send your infrastructure logs and your endpoint logs. Whether you're a Splunk shop, an Archer, Sumo, Elastic, whatever your SIM solution is, you likely have a significant investment in that team and that solution. And I've seen too many security vendors, not just in SaaS, all over the place, come and pitch me on solutions that require a new single pane of glass. At Salesforce, I think we probably procured 50 single panes of glass. So I'm very suspicious of anyone that tells me their solution is the new single pane of glass for XYZ. My team is gonna, and your team's gonna log into this new single pane of glass and you're gonna do your job great. Operations teams have plenty of single panes of glass. So my view is with SaaS, put the data where you're already working so that you can combine it with infrastructure data and endpoint data, have this total view of a user. Tim has a laptop, Tim logged into a server, and then Tim logged into Salesforce. That's a holistic view. If I'm siloing those in new single pane of glass solutions, I don't really get the same value out of that. So there you go. A SaaS security program. Just like that, this is a lot of work, but I think the one takeaway I would give you is not that this is a huge chunk of work that you need to immediately start thinking about that's totally novel or totally foreign to you. The main thing I want you to come away with and start thinking about is that your critical data as a business, the data that you as security leaders and security organizations are tasked with protecting, is also in SaaS. And so we as an industry need to really be thinking about SaaS with the same level of criticality and suspicion that we think about infrastructure and endpoints, networks, and other critical parts of the business. We've let it be a blind spot for too long. And it's really time to start treating it like a full-fledged part of the critical infrastructure of the business, because the data that's in it, it merits that distinction. So thank you for taking the time to listen to me for 40 minutes, 45 minutes today. Really appreciate getting the chance to speak with all of you. And it looks like we have 5 minutes, a little less than I hope, but we do have some time for questions. So Jacob, are there any questions that I should answer?
Yeah, so first, Tim, thank you again for the presentation. Definitely very interesting, and I think right on point in terms of focusing on SaaS security. There is a couple, you have access to the chat, right, Tim?
Yeah, let me pull it up. Just got a different part of my screen. Yeah, okay. Yes, all right, so I see this question. In a typical on-prem infrastructure, you have security baselines built on CIS, DISA, et cetera, for OS database, et cetera. For SaaS, what's your opinion on writing such documents? Big SaaS players have some automated tools to produce security scores, but is this good to replace your baseline doc considering quick change in nature of SaaS? That's a great question. It's actually something that we think a lot about. So CIS and some other players actually do have some SaaS baselines. One that comes to mind is the CIS baseline for Microsoft 365. it's great. And we as a company and some of the security practitioners at AppOmni are actually engaging constantly with some of these frameworks to try and develop SaaS baselines. MITRE ATT&CK is another one that we're working with as we can, and then other open source frameworks to try and contribute our learnings about SaaS into them, because I agree that standardized frameworks are really important here. What we do is provide our security expertise in the form of baseline policies. So I think that a lot of the baselines that are published are incomplete, or there are complete ones, but only for certain SaaS clouds. So I do think as an industry, we are missing baseline policies for all the SaaS clouds that are in use. And that's one of the things we strive to provide. You mentioned security scores. And again, I would put this as something that some providers do, and they have value, certainly. But again, it's not complete enough. And so it's where we come in, we try and provide those baseline scores and baseline recommendations for all SaaS clouds. I'll take Salesforce as an example. Salesforce has a great system called the Security Health Check score. The problem is it focuses on what I would consider a relatively narrow set of the most high value settings. So I don't want to say that Salesforce Security Score is not valuable, or Salesforce Security Health Check rather. It's definitely valuable. It is just not as comprehensive as I would like to see. And so that's where we try and add additional value and additional research from our team. The last piece I would say is that Microsoft Security Score, Salesforce Security Health Check, all of these individual implementations have a lot of value, but they are service specific. So even if every SaaS cloud had a perfect benchline and benchmarking system, which is not the case, but even if they all did, you're still tasking someone with logging into 50 plus systems and potentially multiple instances of each one of those systems to collect the data and ensure that it stays up to date. I would argue that as a security organization, what we want is a centralized view that can condense that data, tell me where to focus my energy, and then also add in things like compliance. So the built-in systems are the provider's view of security, and they don't necessarily correspond to your specific implementation of the SaaS cloud or to your specific compliance concerns. So I kind of put all of those things as valuable, kind of balanced parts of a whole breakfast, right? They don't solve the whole problem. They're just components of your solution.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Just one last question here before we wrap up.
Yep.
When building a SaaS security program, what steps, actions do you feel are likely to provide the best return on investment? Yeah.
So as you build the program, this kind of map that I talked about at the end, this is the whole program. So it's not what you're going to do overnight. I look at this as an iterative process. So what is the thing I could do fastest? The thing I can do fastest is bring in a capability or build a capability to receive SaaS audit data in the place I'm already working. That's like the bare minimum. And again, I kind of talked about why event log data with SaaS isn't the most valuable, but it is absolutely the fastest to get into place. The next thing I think is posture scanning. So bringing in a solution that like I mentioned just the last question, can look at all my SaaS clouds and get me a baseline for all of them. That's my next step. But those both require the inventory. So absolutely the first thing you need to do is understand what SaaS clouds your enterprise uses. A couple of suggestions for doing that. I honestly would go to procurement and say, can you give me every PO for a SaaS cloud? And maybe give them a list of the ones you're most concerned about, Salesforce, Workday, Slack, GitHub, Microsoft, ServiceNow, whatever. Try and get a baseline inventory, however you can, across the business of who's using SaaS clouds, and start to use that as driving your selection of what technology you need to put in place to monitor them. And it's also then going to drive your relationship building, because all the teams that have purchased SaaS clouds and deployed them, you're going to need to create relationships with them and invest time with making them your partners. Security bringing down the hammer and adding new regulations is very infrequently well received. So you want to build a collaborative relationship with them and say, we want to enable your use of these SaaS clouds. Security is going to help you by providing continuous monitoring and baselines and guardrails. And we just need your support to ensure that we're all maintaining the security of the business.
Thank you, Tim.
Well, I think we're out of time.
Yeah, we're out of time.
Yeah.
We appreciate everybody attending. Again, if there are any questions, feel free to send them my way, jacob@appomni.com, JACOB. And again, thank you all for attending, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone next month on the June webinar. Thank you.